Initiative for Indian and Alaska Native Education in December 2011. Bill Ogala Sichenju Lakota grew up on the Pine Ridge and Rosebud Sioux reservations in South Dakota. Bill has experienced firsthand, through his professional and life experiences, the multitude of challenges facing American Indian students, educators, and tribes. In addition to being a teacher and principal, Bill has worked at the school, professional, and community level to help foster leadership development and civic engagement among American Indians. Integral to his professional and academic capacity has been his experiences as a tribal college student at Haskell Indian Nations University, St. Galaska University, and Ogala Lakota College. Bill previously served as the Deputy Director and Executive Director for the White House Initiative on Tribal Colleges. Since his appointment in January 2011, he has provided leadership to key administration initiatives, including Executive Order 13592, Tribal Leaders Speak, the State of Indian Education 2010 report, State Tribal Education Partnership Pilot, and 2012 ED-DOI Memorandum of Understanding. Before coming to Washington, D.C., Bill was working towards a doctorate in education leadership at Montana State University. He earned his Bachelor of Arts in Humanities from Fort Lewis College in 2005 and a Master of Education from Montana State University in 2010. The title of Bill's presentation is The White House Initiative on American Indian and Alaska Native Education, Improving American Indian and Alaska Native Opportunities and Strengthening Tribal Colleges and Universities. The White House Initiative on American Indian and Alaska Native Education leads the implementation of President's Executive Order 13592 by working closely with federal agencies and offices to help ensure American Indian and Alaska Native participation in the development and implementation of key administration education priorities. Director Mendoza will provide updates on the continued collaboration between Secretary Duncan and Secretary Jewell regarding students attending BIE and tribally controlled colleges, or tribally controlled schools, including the progress of the Joint Committee on Indian Education and the American Indian Education Study Group. He will also provide updates on capacity building efforts related to TCUs, Native Serving Institution initiatives, the Native Language Work Group, the President's 2015 budget request, and his My Brother's Keeper Boys and Young Men of Color initiative. Please join me in welcoming Bill Mendoza.
Mitak yapi, chalya iuha lila chante washte nabe chiu zapalo. La kol chaje mitaki trawaha chanka wakangle. Washichu ia Bill Mendoza etaha. Oglala na sichangu la kota titua, cheti shakoi, oma hitu. Greet you all in my language, the Lakota language. You never know when you're in the presence of relatives, and it would be inappropriate for me to not address them with the appropriate protocol. Thank you so much, Larry, for that kind introduction, and thank you so much to the organizers, especially Dr. Reinhardt and President Haynes, whom I was able to meet today and have a great conversation about the exciting things that have happened here at Northern Michigan, and also the bright future that's ahead of them because of all of your good work. I can't say enough about Dr. Reinhardt and how much of a just passionate and committed leader that you have, and I'm sure you all know this all too well, but just want to validate and assure you that what's happening here in Michigan is at the national level, is not only recognized but valued, and Dr. Reinhardt is a champion of that, and I just personally really appreciate him. I was but a graduate student, just full and hungry for information at Montana State University when I was able to first interact with Dr. Reinhardt, and he was the one who introduced me to, and I don't even know if he's coined this term or what, but the concept and value and notion of that trilateral relationship, of which I know those of you who've been able to interact with him, he's pretty much drilled into your head, if not, forced it there. I just really want to commend him and his leadership and everything that he's doing here for his community. We have about 45 minutes together today, and I'm actually trying something different. I'm gonna time myself and hope that I don't talk over the next speaker. But I want to make sure we get some quality time together, and then leave some time for question and answers too. And I'm going to kind of base my comments off of how much I'm a teacher, I'm a principal. So I know satiation when I see it, and so if I see that glossy-eyed look and that food kicking in, I'm gonna jump into much more interaction here sooner than later. So in Larry's introduction, which these introductions are always painful. They're as grateful as I am of them. They're but for a speaker, the moment in time where you kind of assess yourself. They're the worst self-assessment when you're expected to get up there and be inspirational and be informative at the same time and try to balance those. And what my introduction boils down to is I'm a product of the kinds of efforts that you all are engaged in right now and have experienced undoubtedly. And I've signed us up for a lot. By extension of you, I'm put in a position of having to carry that charge, those needs that you reflect, and all the merits that come with them and speak for them at the national level. And so those executive orders, the memorandums, agreements, the initiatives that were touched on, I'm going to speak to each of those, hopefully in their entirety, to expose you what's happening with them. But they're just that. They're charges. They're calls to action that at the tender age that I'm at, but yet the responsible age. I'm not youth anymore. I can't claim that anymore. And the more that I stay in Washington, D.C., my hair tends to kind of express that. I've always had a long braid, ever since high school, but it seems to be getting longer and sliding back further, which I'm pretty troubled by. So I'm not a youth anymore, but I know that there's a dire need for more taking responsibility for these issues at every level. And so with that, I just express that commitment to you, as I do all across the country, that I recognize and value that stability is a huge concern for Indian education in particular. And so the issues that we talk about today and that you are engaged in undoubtedly in kind of this focus on service learning couldn't be more interdisciplinary and couldn't be more essential to the kinds of paradigm shift that we're in right now. And truly, we are in a paradigm shift. We are what 40 years ago, 70 years ago, as young as it seems, those issues are at our doorstep right now when we're talking about the next iteration, the next wave of what that notion that all of us know all too well as self-determination and self-governance means within our communities. That point in time is here right now. And at the nexus of that kind of paradigm shift, we're saying no longer are we going to approach these issues in the siloed fashion that we have in the past. We've needed to focus on those issues in order to establish that foundation, and we've worked so hard in this generation, if you will, to shore up and scaffold that work. Now the next step, the effort on the horizon, if you will, is our necessity to connect those dots and to make sure that we're creating And as much as I hate it, especially in the current context coming from the Great Plains, the pipeline of education, we are needing to have that predictable path. And if I could use a much more relevant term, we've always had those paths. We've always had those routes where we knew that we could go to in times of trouble, and which we ventured from in very methodical and strategic ways for time immemorial. And so in that way, we knew exactly where we were, we knew what to expect, and in the event that we came upon something different, we knew how to approach it and grapple with it in a way that was not only conducive to us, but also in responsibility to all things unknown. And that is really the beauty of who we are as a people. No matter where I go in the country, we epitomize what it means to live beyond ourselves, humanity, if you will. And we've been in a struggle to bring back those interconnectedness, those interdependence that are reflective of how we saw the world pre-contact and how we've been fighting to maintain, for not just the sake of humanity, but everything in existence and everything that is unknown. And for us, Lakota, that's the Wakantanka, not the Great Spirit as the priests have translate that to be, but the unexplained, the mysterious, the unknown, everything that is sacred and of value and anything that we can't immediately explain right now was treated with the utmost respect. Not fear, but respect and a little bit of understanding of cautiousness within that. And that's, again, this comes full cycle in our understanding of how we see this, and yet there's an element of an environment of complacency that is kind of established in that same sense. The overwhelmingness that can become too overwhelming at different times is something that we continually have to grapple with. And in the field of discipline, really, the field now, as we've kind of Western viewpoint has kind of taken to frame this in terms of service learning, active, engaged citizens of nations, which at best in its current context amounts to abstractions. And we could boil that down real easy to being a good relative. And being in that state of being a good relative, it's very active, very, very mobilizing, very organizing, and living in that true sense of that interrelatedness and interdependence. And really that's what service learning is to me at the community level, and taking responsibility for all those things that we say, gosh, we got to do something about that. Really? It's kind of troublesome. Instead of taking that in and then turning away, taking responsibility for that and saying, oh, if I can't do anything about that, who else might be able to do it? How can I build that bridge? How can I connect those dots? And how can we make our community better? And I know in many respects, I'm singing to the choir here on these issues, singing to the drum group in an even more relevant way. And so, but you are the champions at that forefront. And just as I'm inspired to be here with you, I hope some of the things that we talk about here today are as inspiring to you and kind of connecting it to the work that you're doing. One of the first things is that this initiative, as new as it is, and it feels old to me because I've been on the ground with this work in Washington, D.C. and across Indian country for about 2 years now, is about you all. The reality that our conversations around Indian policies centered on two critical but yet historic factions of Indian education and facets of Indian education. The Bureau of Indian Education and its subset of schools and students and tribes that have that as a vehicle and utility, and the unique nature of that system, as well as the most recent tribal colleges and universities, was the laser-light focus of Indian education policy. And it's one that's both given us the opportunities that we have now, but has also kind of faced us with the challenges of not being able to be on the collaborative, and as I'm a kind of recovering male warrior, on the offensive, in terms of those vast majority of students who are attending schools that fall within both the real policy and fiscal jurisdictions of states and local control, both at the early learning all the way through 12th grade on up to higher education. And so the mechanisms, the systems of being able to affect those in a meaningful way, from everything to the policy, the standards, the assessments, the benchmarks, notions of growth and gain, and the resources that are aligned to that, the curriculum, if you will, the strategies that are implicit and explicit within that, the theoretical framework for teaching and learning, and the methods of knowing and being, all of the philosophical, the spiritual, the pragmatic, all wrapped into that, the objective. Those have all been dictated and dominated and grappled over by populations, and we've largely been at the periphery of that. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but the point that I'm making here is that that's been a part that we need to be more active in. We need to be more purposeful about, and we need to ask those really tough questions of ourselves on what we're doing to embark upon those very real and very dangerous contexts. Those are hard conversations to be in. I was just in Philadelphia with a student there at the University of Pennsylvania. I can't even imagine going to school in Philadelphia and having come from an Indian community, and some of the environmental changes that they're going through. I mean, I've experienced some of that to the degree. If you caught that, I've attended 5 universities and secured my bachelor's in the span of 8 years. And it took me that long to not only earn my way within those institutions, but to establish the respect and admiration for what it could do to be a catalyst for me in the things that I wanted to see happen in my communities. And so I've experienced it in that way, but a school like University of Pennsylvania, and the student was saying, I'm in a class of 300, and it's just day in, day out. I'm like, not only going at it with my peers, but I'm going at it with my professor, and we're just, I'm not making any headway in the course of it. You could sense his emotion. You could sense, the isolation that he feels in that, and rather than be sympathetic to him, I chose to be empathetic and said, man, how lucky you are. How awesome you have that opportunity, and thank you for having the courage to take on those conversations and to embark upon that journey, that battle. And those are the kinds of environments that very few of us are putting ourselves in. And we know that this ain't the case for every student, that in many respects that sets them up to fail, right? Because we know that, because we're losing as much as 70% of them as they enter institutions around the country. And I'll let you be your own judge on what that experience is like here. And we know that we have to do better in that respect for the masses. But we also have to arm those individuals. We have to equip them with the knowledge and skills to fight those battles on the periphery as well. So when we're doing that from this level, in this executive order, it was just about that. Taking this from the Bureau of Indian Education and tribal colleges and saying what is good about those systems, what is a challenge, what is an opportunity in the same framing, and how can we have that be affected beyond that to school districts, or as we think of them from the Department of Education standpoint, local education agencies. That's exactly how the statute refers to them. Nobody ever says school districts. And so local education agency, local controls, and the policy interactions levels at that level, school boards, being a big part of setting the agenda on that level at the implementation stages, and then also looking at the realities of the state educational agency systems. And those of you who know the insides of school funding, school finance at that level, know that there's a nice dance that happens with those entities. And then you take it to the federal level, and there's even much more divisiveness in terms of federalism added on to just those dynamics alone. And we're not even in those pictures in many respects. And so the notion of this trilateral responsibility and relationship, when Dr. Reinhardt exposed me to that in 2007, I was like, that's it. That's the problem. That's where it all rests. And everybody who is exposed to that understands that. And yet that is something that we cannot regulate our way to. That is something that we cannot dictate to these sovereigns. It is something that has to be built from the ground up, has to be methodical. It's not going to be a short-term fix. it's going to be, heavy, hard work by folks like you that get us to that point. And so this initiative was the first step in taking that direction towards that trilateral strengthening of this nation, and really following through with not only the federal trust responsibility, but establishing that trust relationship in more meaningful ways and stronger ways with the states in which our tribal nations share space with. And so that's why this initiative was built. And it allowed us then to take ourselves from conversations of not only race-based conversations on the higher education side and the unique trust responsibility that we have to tribes and those who have tribal colleges, and just talking about higher education stuff all the time. It allowed us to then step into every realm that is affecting this country's educational plight. And arguably, yes, we are going through a paradigm shift as a whole in the standards-based reform, alignment to college and career-ready standards, and ensuring that we're preparing our students for the 21st century knowledge-based economy, is one that the nation as a whole is gripping itself with and preparing itself for and trying to be responsive to. And so we kind of got a double whammy now. We've got some progress, we've got this new scope, this new scale that we're thinking about, and we're trying to move forward in that direction. And it's allowed us to come to communities like Marquette. It's allowed us to go down to Elko, Nevada on the Great Basin. It's allowed us to take this conversation to California, to Washington, and over to Alaska. And I mean, this is critical because all too often the politics, if you still go to DC now, we're still combating the notion that Indian education, thought the BIE was taking care of that. Well, they only have the levers to affect 6% of our students, PK to 12 at best. Even if you add in tribal colleges and universities to that mix, you don't even break 100,000. You don't even break 75,000 when you throw in those students. So how can we address the critical needs, all the disparaging indicators that you and I know, that 30% return on our investment at best, equation that we deal with, and how do we get out of those deficit conversations and start talking about the added value nature of our nations and what we contribute, and then not only that, how is this affecting that notion of that unique identity, and what the substance is of that sovereign identity is. And that's what's really at stake here. You're not a nation unless you're unique. You're not Indian unless you're unique. If you're like them, like that, like those, there's no difference there. It's a very basic definition of diversity in my book. And so how are we maintaining that uniqueness of 566 different tribes? How are we revitalizing and preserving and perpetuating those 300 languages? Now that doesn't mean, don't get me twisted here, that doesn't mean run out and throw on your moccasins and put on that choker and learn how to introduce yourself as best as you can. Yeah, it might be about that. That might be the first step to that. But there's a lot more substance to that we have to individually and collectively put ourselves on a path towards affecting. Otherwise, we are going to be susceptible to the rest of it. And those of you who are not of those origins, hey, we don't have enough Indians, we'll take you. Yeah, we already established that there's only 1% of us. And if we could have others think like us, and this has also been our added value, to think beyond humanity, I think that's a good thing for this world. And so how are we doing that? What's the nuts and bolts of my job? My job centers around those understandings, those memorandums of agreements, those tools, those initiatives that we can build out to affect these critical areas of need. And first and foremost for us, that is the Joint Committee on Indian Education. It's really bringing the BIE in as a partner. It took us a year and a half to sign this darn MOU, and we're trying to, not spread ourselves too thin, but at the same time, make sure that we're accounting for things, because we are, after all, trying to institutionalize these efforts. And so critical areas there are certainly opportunities. When we talk about STEM, when we talk about workforce development, when we talk about all of these other fields and disciplines, how are we making sure that American Indian and Alaska Natives are included in that comma separated value? And then when they're included in there, that we're also including in that explicitly that unique relationship, because that's different. And I have to put it in these terms that we understand that treating certain populations differently when we think about other critical areas of our being and livelihood as a nation, namely our veterans, namely our farmers, namely business sectors, and that asset of which we hold so value, our land, is the one that we lay claim to. And the fact that we welcomed this country, and based off of that, we made this agreement, your grandfathers, my grandfathers, our word, beyond our word, we agreed to it on your terms as the law of the land. And so that basis is from which that uniqueness derives. And that added value for us means then, yeah, there's rights, there's liberties that are involved and entailed in that. And so inclusion within every initiative is what we're striving for, to have that inserted. And so at every level, whether you're at the state, whether you're at the local, trying to get that acknowledged, trying to get that embraced is not a barrier to inclusion, but rather an added value to inclusion in the way that we're in this together. And whether I'm in urban centers, whether I'm in between there, I was talking about this in Philadelphia as well. I don't know what you call Rapid City. I don't know what you call Farmington, New Mexico, or maybe even Marquette. But it's not an urban center. But there's certain benefits that go with that, and there's certain unique challenges that go with that as well. But in those areas especially is where these questions are really the rubber is hitting the road on them. The Joint Committee meets on a quarterly basis. We discuss broad goals of the executive order, goals that you and I would agree on, those opportunities, how are we addressing those outcomes, which strategies are we employing, and what is the presence of the quality of experience for our students in those systems. And what that means is native language, history, and culture. That being a foundation of success for our students before we have any other discussion about quality, about access, about equity. If we cannot answer that question, or at least put ourselves on a path towards addressing that issue, our students are going to either go into harm's way or are going to start out in harm's way in any system if you're not grappling with the notion of what you as educators and practitioners know as differentiation. That's a principle of teaching, that's a best practice of teaching, and that for Americans and Alaska Natives is one where tribes and educators and local communities have to come together on one. And as I was looking at your agenda, and I'd hoped to make it back for some of the conversations today, you're getting at the heart of those issues. The second mechanism for us is, of course, the high-level engagement of this, and we have the President's Interagency Working Group on Indian Education, which interacts with a number of Indian affairs-related working groups as well. These sound really boring, and quite frankly, they are, but they are the mechanisms of accountability at the federal level, where we are able to push on these bureaucracies and dance their dance and work in the ways that they are held accountable to get down to those goals, get down to that next level of measurable objectives, get down to the next level of those benchmarks and those data-informed decisions. And so this interagency working group is the toughest one that we're dealing with now. And here's why. When we talked about the BIE, when we talked about the tribal college universities, what was beyond that? What is beyond that? Is there an identity for Northern Michigan University? Is there identity for Wisconsin-Madison or, Fort Lewis College? They might be a minority-serving institution, but is that respective of that sovereign relationship? No. We have Hispanic serving institutions, we have predominantly black institutions, we also have Asian American and Pacific Islander institutions. We do not have what is known as native serving institutions. And this is a critical step for higher education especially. And we have school districts, we have local education agencies, all annotated with public, right? But we don't have tribally connected school districts, which we know is at the heart of not being able to address these and those collaborations. Where do we point all of this effort? Where do we direct it? I mean, communities are grappling with this the most, but at the federal level, at the state level, we have not created that identity of kind of where we want this maintenance of effort, this establishment of effort to take place, and where we need to identify promising, if not best practices. And so that's what we're going through now with the federal agencies, is where to point them. We have some very excited partners. They just want to know, how do I get there? You know, I've gone to this conference and that, reached out to that organization, and we all have great talks, but we can't ever seem to really get down to beyond the rhetoric and get down to the work. And so how are we getting down to that level? And so we are taking the charge in developing that national network of individuals with the Interagency Working Group on Indian Education, and looking at creating those definitions. And we've already taken a step towards creating that one for Native serving institutions. And it's one that I hope, and talking with President Haynes, that we can work towards getting Northern Michigan on that list. And right now that's about 98 institutions nationwide. They meet 10% or 300 students. And we take that 10% or 300 students and we take the average of the previous 3 years enrollment. Self-identified, we can go all day with this whole issue of self-identification. But the point is we got to throw the dart on the board. We got to draw a line on the wall, and we need a baseline. And so utilizing that measure, accounting for both the percentage and the number of students, and we get 98 institutions nationwide that are not tribal colleges and universities. You know, tribal colleges and universities are unique. Many of them are two-year institutions, so their students go somewhere. We want to map and correlate and develop partnerships with those tribal colleges and these Native serving institutions so that there's a seamless transition between those institutions, and we think that they're strongest among these 98 institutions. And as we dig down deeper into the connections between these institutions, I hope to find the kinds of partnerships that we can then model for those institutions that demonstrate some level of programmatic commitment to our students. You and I know them well. Penn State University, Dartmouth College, Yale University. You know, we have institutions across the country that have set up endowments. They've set up specific programs and centers to support these institutions. Given the fact that Northern Michigan isn't on that list, I would include them in that category. And so the question is, those who are on the bubble, how do we get them off the bubble? That's change. That will move the needle for our students. And the fact that we're using an average for the previous years, well, that will get at the enrollment and the retention issues as well, and hopefully lead to better graduation rates as well. Many of the institutions that are on this list are two-year colleges as well. And so we know that we're not quite getting to the improving opportunities for all American Indian Alaska Native students, but it's a critical first step, and one that I hope becomes one that's codified within statute. That's the next level of motivation. When I said that we have no classification for Native serving institutions, I wasn't quite accurate, but I had to get the dramatic point across first to you all. And we do have a small $5 million pot within the department that is devoted to what we call Native American serving non-tribal institutions. If you thought my initiative acronym was bad, this one's pretty tough. It's NASNTI. NASNTI, and I always tease the tribal colleges and say, not to be confused with NASNTI, so they can laugh at that joke too as well. But if that doesn't give you an indication of the politics between tribal colleges and Native serving institutions, I don't know what does. And for those of you who don't, please turn to your neighbors and at another time and talk about those issues. But it's our students, it's a business, in many respects. A lot of these institutions are really fighting for students as well, And so, we got to work together in that. We got to fix that. The other mechanism for us is the National Advisory Council on Indian Education and channeling their efforts. So cradle to career, cradle to grave, lifelong learning as we know it in Indian country. This advisory council, who is meeting today, and I provided a report to today, and will also be meeting tomorrow, taking public comment. There's a Federal Register notice. I'll make sure that Dr. Reinhardt gets this information so he can send it out to you if you want to testify and provide testimony to their convening. They are building their annual report to Congress right now. It's due June 30th. You can reach out to those members at any time. Make sure you get that list. And then there are 4 vacancies on that council as well. That Federal Register notice is also imminent on placement of those 4 positions. And so if you know anybody, you know colleagues, want to make sure that you get your nominations in for those individuals. The third component of our initiative and priority has been Native languages, histories, and cultures. And so in this way, we've signed ourselves on to specifically addressing this, but also leveraging the partnerships of our sister agencies, if you will, Department of Interior, as well as the Health and Human Services and the Administration for Native Americans specifically, who operate Esther Martinez language preservation monies over there. And so our coordination is going to be critical in changing the environment at the federal level for language preservation and revitalization. And so, everything from identifying barriers to providing, clarity around the continuum of grants so that we can provide, better understanding on ways that you can better support sustainably efforts within tribal communities to revitalize and preserve languages. That's where this work is happening. Everything from what are we measuring, how are we defining success, and how are we resourcing that? Where are the gaps, and where are we being inefficient? And how can we be more efficient and effective in the role that we play? 9 times out of the 10, this is better communication. 9 times out of the 10, this is technical assistance. Indian country is really looking for just clarification and guidance in many respects. And sure, it takes money, but we have a lot of tribes out there who are willing to step up and resource something, but they're not going to go into it blindly. They're not going to make an uninformed effort, only yield further compounding results on their communities. And so they're really working hard to kind of gather this information and frame it in a way that they're making an informed decision about, how they're delegating limited resources, as we all are. And so we need to be better partners in that work, and that's where this is leading to, is that on June 20th, we will be having a Native language summit in Washington, D.C. And I know that, it's in Washington, D.C. Consider this 1.0 Native Language Summit. And we've been coordinating with the grantees from Administration for Native Americans, as well as from the Department of Education and our Office of English Language Acquisition, where we have our NAM grants there. And so those language grants, specifically for Native English learners, is a critical point for us as well. And so we're taking, the repository of knowledge that we have in this area, bringing them together on this issue. And of course, that invitation is widely put for those of you who have resources to be able to participate there. I mentioned, or actually Larry mentioned, the Indian Education Study Group with the Bureau of Indian Education. And I know this is an issue many tribes are interested, even if they don't have Bureau of Indian Education schools. And so, the efficiency and effectiveness, and as the most recent General Accountability Office's report on that management of the BIE has raised new and of course, historic issues around the Bureau of Indian Education, we're trying to address those issues, and all the way back into the first term, Secretary Duncan had reached out to Secretary Salazar in this respect and saying, what can we do? And there was, in those conversations that were, just charging the environment, where everything from move the BIE to the Department of Education, well, that wasn't something that was even seriously even discussed, much less tribal leaders were like, no way, and then everything to completely blow up the BIE within Interior and send all the money to tribes. And as you can imagine, tribal educators were like, hell no, no way. The only people we don't like worse than the BIE is our own tribes. So, you see right now where those kind of divisive issues, those conflicts of tribal local control and tribal governance, come into convergence. And so just in those conversations, where we're at now is we're at the point of consultation on 30,000-foot level understandings of what we're seeing happening in BIE. And no surprise, there's a lot of inefficiency. There's a lot of funding stream and governance structure that needs to be addressed in order for them to be a better service deliverer. And there's even within that regulations that need to be changed. There needs to be a statutory and regulatory revision in order to get at a 21st century fine-tuned federal school system. And so for about 9 months now, there has been a study group that has been formed comprising of a small group, but that have enlisted from around the country experts in the field, and of course those who are connected most to this work. And so everybody from the former Department of Defense education system director to school reform expert like Kenneth Wong out of Brown University, myself, the secretary, the Bureau of Education director Monty Russell, and then a select few others that have just been intense immersed in trying to look at what is the framework, what is the data telling us, what is the feedback that we have had for a long time on the Bureau of Education, how is that different now by going out to educators and tribal leaders, and what do we need to do to address that. And so the time for action is now. And so if you're not connected to that and you have an investment in it, and it does affect your work, as I said, the BIE needs to be the model. It needs to be where we are exercising practices that are affecting, both the mainstream aspirations, and I think tribal communities share and value these as well, but also the tribal-centric ways of knowing and being. That is where that should be the model of excellence for us, and it should all emanate from out of there into those systems which we feel like are not as responsive and inclusive of those kinds of teachings and settings. On April 9th, I'll be testifying in front of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs on behalf of the administration, and specifically Secretary Duncan, on Indian education, specifically in public schools. And so their framing that they've asked me to do is to articulate the context of what our American Indian Alaska Native students are doing, are experiencing within public schools. And so, look forward to more conversation around that. Senator Tester is the new chairman of Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, coming from Montana. So he's going to bring with it the exciting things that are happening in Montana around Indian education for all, and essential understandings being codified at the state level, trying to be that partner for leading the way and partnering with tribes and utilizing all of the rich heritage, the history, and the human capital, all wrapped into being a benefit for all citizens of Montana. He's going to be bringing that to the conversation, and that I talk to them next month, as a matter of fact, and not that they're not going through their own struggles and trying to get down to some of these levels in more meaningful ways. It gets more and more complex, harder and harder, as you kind of come across some of these milestones. But there's just exciting conversations happening right now, and yet we still have all of these institutional levers that we have not yet reauthorized or enacted. And so the mobilization around these issues are right now. Workforce Investment Act, Carl Perkins, Esther Martinez, ESEA, Health Education Act, all of those acts are all up for reauthorization. And so whatever makes it through, you need to understand what is happening there and how it impacts your community. With that, the last high-level initiative that I want to talk to you about is the President's My Brother's Keeper initiative. And thank you so much to everybody who has kind of mobilized around making sure that I can have a conversation with your boys and young men around what they are experiencing. And so announced a little over a month ago, at the end of February, the President announced that there are two parts to this initiative. One, a private investment side of this, to the tune of $150 million in resources right now that are going to raise awareness and directly affect the issues of boys and young men of color, and then $200 million in commitments into the future. And there is just right now on that private side and that collaboration, a huge coordination happening and interest in this initiative. And then on the federal side, the commitment of federal agencies to do some very specific things, but also to keep the conversation open, knowing that there's a lot that needs to be discussed here and a lot that needs to be made available to be able to affect this population. And so everything from creating a data dashboard, identifying promising practices, what is working in this area, and then as we look to the future, the sustainability of this initiative and what comes of federal programming in this respect. What levers are being utilized right now at the federal level, and how are they in alignment with what we know is working and what is not working, and so addressing that. And so the initiative itself is kind of functioning in those two ways. The train and the plane, is being built. Like I said, it's moving fast. And so right now, what we need from you, what we need from your communities, is one, telling your boys and young men's stories. They need to go to whitehouse.gov / whatever, however you want to say that, My Brother's Keeper, and just tell their story. Just how are they doing? How did they get to where they are? We need to have that story told, because we need to have a representation of Indian country that, in my hopes, is beyond the 1%. When I look at the breakdown of those stories that are told there, I want to say that, because of our efforts, we were able to get more than 1% of the stories that were submitted to there. The organizations that were doing this work, we met or exceeded the 1% of the organizations that all submitted information to there. So I need your help in kind of reaching that internal goal. The White House is committed to us to monitor the submissions so that we can get back to you all if there's specific questions, and then they want to be responsive to that. So whether it's an individual story or an organization's story, we need that information and who's doing this work. We know that there's organizations out there that are just doing phenomenal things. So even if you don't even know the name of it, but you know where it's at, please go in there and submit it. It's a real easy form submission. Again, that's whitehouse.gov / My Brother's Keeper. The essential part of kind of understanding the level that we're dealing with in that initiative is that it's dealing with 0 to 25, age 0 to 25. And so when we talk about the 0, everybody wonders about the 0. Of course, we're talking about homes in this respect. We're talking about parental engagement and the necessity for us to ensure that the early learning component of this is considered, and how important it is to start our students off on the right foot. The only other component I think that I really want to stress to you is, of course, the President's budget and a pot of money that has been included in there, and that's the Race to the Top Equity and Opportunity. It's the next iteration of getting down to disaggregated populations and how we can begin to better address the achievement gap and close that. And so this $300 million pot is designed to drive comprehensive change in how our states and local educations identify and close that educational and opportunity achievement gap. And so I want you to really, kind of keep that on your radar as states, in the event that this competition becomes reality under the president's budget, as states begin to compile that. This is where we get into the kinds of nuances that we dealt with in flexibility and tribal colleges or tribal communities, raising concerns to us about not being included in that process. So now all of these national initiatives, whether they're competitive or formula or whatnot, we're trying to really get out in front of them and say, make those connections with your state educational agency, make those connections with your governor's office, whomever is submitting those applications on your state's behalf. So I wanted to make sure and flag that for you. I am at 47 minutes, so I think I'm doing pretty good. Pretty proud of myself. And I just want to close with, again, thanking you for having me into your community. I know, the 5 tribal communities that we have here, are very active. Me coming into your community is as much about working to connect you to what is happening nationally, but also to channel and carry forward the concerns of your communities as well as this region's. And the conversations that I've already been engaged with today are just really, really exciting. And so I look forward to our evening and getting to spend some more time with you all. And as I speak with tribal leaders tomorrow as well, I've already made commitments to come back to this area of the country and to understand some of the more nuanced interactions that are happening here. So just really encourage you to step up, continue to step up as you have done, both locally, regionally, and nationally, and just really modeling that service learning that I know as you are breaking from this conference in the next couple of days or so, making sure that you leave and that work is purposeful. So again, thank you to the organizers for allowing the initiative to come in here and share a little bit about what we're doing, and thank you for all of your hard work and your inspiring. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions, expand, clarify. And as I say sometimes, I'm a teacher and a principal, so I'm trained in wait time, and I'm also Indian, so I'm perfectly comfortable with silence too. So I could just stand here and look at you, not look at you, whatever you need me to do.
Okay, so is there any questions for Bill? If so, I'll pass the microphone to you and you can ask it.
So, you talked a little bit about STEM initiatives that are part of this, and we know that Native students and Native people in general are very underrepresented in the STEM fields. So are there particular initiatives that might be available to organizations that are kind of working toward that?
Yeah, no, it's an area that we're really concerned about. The presence and prevalence of American and Alaska Natives across the STEM fields, and just taking engineering, for example, we get down into the 0.10s, of representation, and yet when you look at our graduates, we meet or exceed some of the highest levels of placement within engineering, of any ethnicity, and so we know that, through some of the programs, through some of the coordination work that's happening around the country, that we're experiencing success, but yet we're still underrepresented in many of those fields, especially. And so one of the specific endeavors that we're working on with NACME, with SACNAS and ACES, is this NSI mobilization and activity. And so, from that, working with our Office of STEM, the department now has an Office of STEM that has kind of spun off from our policy and process development department. We look forward to more of the specifics that we're doing to address those areas. Right now, we account for those largely through this identification of NSIs and tribal colleges and universities. The TCUP program at NSF is one that we know is very vibrant, contributing to tribal communities. We're also looking at the core levels, knowing that literacy is the gateway to even understanding and affecting those disparaging concerns around mathematics and the sciences is the first starting point too. So we've already begun having conversations with the department around what we can do specifically in that space, and it affects everything from the supplementary funds through Title VII, Johnson O'Malley over at Interior, to everything from Title I, and ensuring that we are included in a disaggregated, delineated fashion, and that we're making sure that those students are being serviced adequately with that cultural responsive education as a basis for affecting those in more meaningful ways than they are now. So when you talk about specific initiatives, I feel like that is integrated throughout our work in those efforts to not only disaggregate information within federal programming, but to strengthen tribal and state coordination and collaboration in those respects, because the participation, the access, and the equity can only come with having those two talk together. And then, of course, the culturally responsive foundation. And I'm sure you know all too well, talking to STEM folks about touchy-feely stuff like culture is very, very tough, but they really, really get it whenever we begin talking about the differentiation and the relevancy components to that it's not reaching our students. So look forward to more to come, and certainly appreciate any suggestions that you have on what we could do specifically in those areas. Neglected to mention one of the interests from ACES in the mentoring side of that, the mentoring component of that is one that's critical for us too, and that affects this My Brother's Keeper initiative as well. Thank you.
I don't need a mic, I don't think.
We actually need that mic.
Oh yeah, we got you.
We're recording.
You got your recording, so just don't badmouth your boss or anything. I don't know where he works. But
I will say that I'm really glad I was able to attend today. Woke up about 5 o'clock in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and my colleague here, Colleen Green, the director of Native American programs at Central Michigan University, sitting here at the table. She only let us stop once from Mount Pleasant to Marquette and St. Ignace, and the only reason we stopped was to get gas. But seriously, thank you so much for coming. And thank you to Larry and Marty and everybody else that helped make this possible. It's well worth our trip up here from Central Michigan University. And I really appreciate your thorough review and description of what is happening in Washington and around the country regarding these issues that we all care deeply about. First, a question of clarification. The $300 million that you just talked about at the end of your explanation regarding education achievement and opportunity gaps, and how people like us might address those gaps. Are those state-generated proposals to Washington?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course we'll have criteria, to frame those proposals, but you can definitely count on, looking at great teachers, great leaders, providing for that disaggregation of, priority populations within that application. And so, those kinds of principles of race to the top and how we've kind of addressed that with the states, the accountability measures, reform measures that are put in place, and of course evidence-based practices are going to be critical components to that. And of course beyond that I can't speak, it's all pretty conceptual at this point, but that's as we get down to the nuts and bolts, I would expect those principles of the administration and the trajectory of the race to the top suite, if you will, to kind of continue to progress in that direction.
Okay, thank you. And secondly, can you share with all of us any upcoming RFPs that would support university and tribal community partnerships that are directly aimed at increasing the high school graduation, college attendance, and college graduation rates of American Indian students?
I'm sure if I was able to, touch base with our post-secondary education team, I could have provided you with a calendar of upcoming RFPs, and I should have. I apologize. So I'll make sure that I get a schedule of any upcoming application opportunities to Marty for distribution of the group. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I know the Alaska Native Hawaiian programs are coming online, and I always point to the Strengthening Institutions programs grant through Title III, both for minority serving institutions and then target populations, Alaska Native Hawaiian, as well as tribally controlled colleges and universities, and this NASNATI grant as well, as places of kind of constant effort to kind of address these unique needs. And then as Dr. Leonard Haynes always reminds me that Title III Aid for Institutional Development is a president's directive on the priority for that grant application, and so that's one that we're stressing around the country, that if you want to pursue unique opportunities, that grant has flexibility to do that. So I don't know if you all are recipients of that grant at all, but I'll definitely be back with you on any other opportunities that are coming up.
Thank you.
And see, this is where this always happens, and as much as I love being in Indian country, it takes you out of DC, and you're truly, talk about, if you're not at the table, you're getting eaten, so I left. We had our briefing on post-secondary education where you hear about all these opportunities, and if you're not there or you don't have your designee or staff there, then you miss that opportunity to then begin to, kind of not only affect those and flag issues, but then to communicate and channel that back out to Indian country. And so there's always that catch-22, but I just realized that I missed that meeting on this leg of trips here to come out this way. So,
thanks, Bill. I'm just wondering if there's any strategic planning in place in improving the data collection, especially at the federal level, with the current FERPA laws and tribes communicating and having our population spread out throughout the United States.
Yeah.
I know with a lot of migrant or transient, they have either statewide databases or federal databases. I'm just wondering if there's any plans in terms of improving the data collection at the federal level.
Yeah, no, and as you know, that issue goes all the way back to Commerce and the U.S. Census Bureau and OMB, and so there's much bigger implications to that than as strong and supported as the President's initiative is. So we're trying to map those issues back right now. What can we affect in terms of the department's race guidance? Where does that derive? Derives directly from OMB circulars and the commerce regulation, and so it goes back to those interpretations. And so there's not a concrete strategy to that right now, but it remains a critical area of concern for our populations, just in the classification categories of the U.S. Census in particular, which are all things derive. And so in that respect, though, even with the recent regulation changes around FERPA and how they are creating greater controls for all the best intentions that you and I would agree upon in principle, and yet balancing that with ensuring that partners that don't have those controls are working towards establishing those controls have made it accessible to tribes and inaccessible in some cases. So you have school districts, you have healthcare facilities, that have tightened up as a result of these new regulations, and some that have, it's created new conversations to access that, and work towards those controls, internal controls being in place for the protection of that sensitive information at all levels. And so we're really trying to provide technical assistance in that role directly to tribes, tribal education agencies, on how they can move forward within regulations right now to get at the level of information and use it in ways that both parties are comfortable to. That doesn't solve the aspirations of receiving that information directly. Tribes continually requesting from us to be able to receive that information directly, and in the event that we can affect that, those controls that are foundational to FERPA would also probably be in place. And so, we're talking about the same data management systems that would need to be in place as well. There's been a lot of interest in the migrant students database, and can we have something like that for Indian country? And it comes down again to resources and what information, what data do we have? How can we pull that versus how do we create a unique system that transcends and taking it to the next step longitudinally, the 50-state equation for American Indian Alaska Native populations. And so, a lot of exciting conversation in that area, and it's just something that, we need to be focusing on more intently. And I think just getting us in that comma-separated value program by program is where our efforts have been kind of preoccupied with right now. So, thank you.
Tom, do you mind if I just respond one thing?
Yeah.
Without getting the microphone to you. Just wanted to add a little bit about relationships between tribes and local school districts. There are tribes that are out there right now doing their own MOUs with the local school districts regarding things that otherwise would be blocked by FERPA until we get some amendments to that that would serve tribal sovereignty and education better in those relationships. But there are schools that are willing to work with their local tribes and also local colleges. Like the university here, we're trying to do that kind of outreach, and hopefully we get more traction on that. I know we've had Bill here to champion for us, and we're going to get as much mileage out of that as we can. So,
and to that effect, I forgot one of our it was mentioned in my introduction, the State Tribal Education Partnership Program. Now, we have moved, once we regulate this program, for this to become a full-blown program within Title VII. And under that program, we have awarded it's a consortia, four grantees. We have the Chickasaw and Choctaw, Chickasaw and Cheyenne Arapaho in Oklahoma, working with their SEA there. We also have Navajo Nation working with New Mexico, and in Coeur d'Alene we have the Nez Perce working with Idaho, and the Umatilla working with their SEA in Oregon. And each one of those grants are unique, but they're all centered around this component of state-tribal coordination and collaboration. And so they have various projects set up. And so what has been kind of born of this grant as well has been the Bureau of Indian Education signing data information access and exchange with Navajo Nation as a result, in the same mechanism of kind of that collaboration, memorandums of understanding. Washington, really huge on this. A lot of exciting things happening there. There's pockets of this happening all over the country. And the really cool thing about it is that it's not something that one of the kind of false things of which I kind of rode for a little while, because it made it seem like we got this done. We're incentivizing the activity. We're not authorizing it. But when STEP grant first came out, everybody's like, cool, we can do these agreements now, It's like, no, you've always had this ability in place. It's just we need to change the mindset around how we're engaging with one another now. and really it's at the core of these issues where, you know, I know scholarships are essential. They're going to need to be essential. There are a barrier. You know, that support to individual students is essential. So is scaffolding their needs with student support services from the tribal level. You know, whether it's meeting, you know, travel expenses or providing tutoring services or having someone be there and building those relationships, resourcing that in some form. You know, providing professional development for them, you know, so that they can navigate that system. Those are all essential. But if we're going to transcend this equation, if we're going to get tribal skin, buy-in, and again, however you want to express it, investment into helping educators transcend this formula that we're dealing with, this advocacy that has almost plateaued, then we're going to have to change that model here for, if not the interim, we're going to need to add to it, and it needs to be tribes having an essential consciousness and understanding around education policy and education financing, and so that they can understand very intimately, very concretely what dynamics these institutions, these school districts are dealing with, and that they can affect them from the standpoint of not only their needs and interests, but also the added value that they bring to these communities and kind of aligning and dovetailing these resources. And this is particularly the case in the diminishing resources for states as well, you know, that are kind of forcing these partnerships in good ways, you know. So these times of austerity, these difficult times are almost creating this environment for us to be able to think in new and innovative ways to get to these understandings of which we've always had access to. It's just now we're coupling with you know, these agreements, and that's where I really sometimes challenge the notion that we have to regulate our way to these behaviors. You know, we just need to work harder at them. Maybe, you know, I know that, trust me, I come from Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and the dynamics there are pretty darn divisive when you talk about the state of South Dakota and how they're working with tribes there. But there's a lot of room for collaboration there as well. So I know it's not a perfect call of action by no means, but it's one that we have to really consider thought on, and I think is demonstrating viability around the country. And so we have examples now. We've always had examples at the state tribal level, but we now have those very concretely at the federal level. So we're working really hard to amplify that message across federal programming, to have those principles of that kind of coordination and collaboration injected into other programs as well. And that's where we get the kind of encouragement, if not, you know, mandated coordination and collaboration at that most strongest nucleus, those tribally connected school districts and institutions of higher education that service that meaningful percentage of American Indian Alaska Native students. I think we had one more question here, but I can, you let me know when okay.
We've been working with the 5 tribes. We've, over the last several years, we've gotten 5 resolutions of support by council for doing environmental protection and trying to find ways to protect our indigenous plants, our medicines, and the people that live in the communities. After, you know what's going on out there. We have so many toxins in the land, and we're up at, my tribe's up at Sault Ste. Marie, we have the carbide and tannery and all that stuff's in the earth and coming out of the water. There's an urgency. I think we've got a model that the tribes agree on, that something needs to be done. We have friends in the U.S. Forest Service. Jan Schultz sitting over here helped with our presentation today. She's the botanist for the Eastern region of the United States, and John Magnuson with the Cedar Tree Institute, and our friends here at the Center for Native American Studies at Northern, and more. And it seems like there's an urgency. I almost didn't ask this question because it's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be asking education, but we find ourselves working with Ojibwa Community College over at KBIC, Bay Mills Community College, Northern. So we seem to be coming into the educational realm to get the word out that there's going to be jobs. We need to protect these plants. We need to learn from these plants about the old ways because of what happened, you know, the
Yeah.
restriction on land, you know, all that. It seems like there's something ready to go. Where do we take it is really my question. Jan probably has a lot better idea because she's been leading with a vision, and John, I came into this about 3 years ago to help because I'm tribal, and I also know that the concern is we're trying to clean up the mess that we've been living in our whole lives. Is killing people, killing plants, and there's an urgency.
Mm-hmm.
So the question really is, you know, does your office have, or your network, you know, can it be consulted with as a, you know, consultation?
Yeah, no, I perfectly understand what you're getting at, and specifically, I don't know at this point, but I think this conversation can lead to that utilization of our network is exactly the role that this initiative wants to play. And here's how we're planning for that and how we've already kind of are building on the success of what tribal colleges have been able to experience in this way. And we want to take that to not only include tribal colleges and universities, but tribes themselves. Tribal colleges in many respects are chartered by, in all respects are chartered by tribes or a consortium of tribes if they're not federally chartered and designated as a tribal college, but in some respects are not eligible for other sets of money that are coming from the federal government. And then you take these notions of these NSIs, and we want to make that reality in having missions that are taking into consideration those tribal needs, those tribal community needs, in the new and different, or as you've already established, the historic ways that we want to be addressing this work. And so from the standpoint of all of the environmental and kind of sectors of interest and the workforce angles of all of this, and education being essential to that path, and then these conversations are much different than and I hear from some of our most veteran, it's like, oh, this is just tracking. This is just tracking our students, into these positions in these career fields, and I don't think that's the case here, because we have both institutions as well as business who kind of learned from that model. Neither one of them got what they needed, and I think in Indian country especially, that's as sensitive, that if we feel like we're working towards a workforce or something, in some respects, you have those who have successfully been meandering in that direction, and then those who have been adversely impacted by that. And I think the lion's share is those who have been adversely impacted by that and don't want that for our future generations. We have to work really hard at letting them know that this is not what we're trying to do. And I think that's what tribal colleges have done to really kind of lead the way and say, no, this is going to be a relevant career that you're going into, and we're going to support you through that and make sure that you're prepared. And so the funding for that right now comes in the forms of grants, contracts, loans, and services. And right now we do an annual data call to federal agencies on those grants, contracts, and services for the tribal college universities. We've added to that this list of NSIs now in the past 2 cycles. Have not yet been able to analyze that information to be able to repackage and share out as not only an accountability point, but also a resource guide to programs direct and indirect for Indian education. And that's the level that I want to be getting at really quickly here with this initiative, is being able to disseminate that kind of information and saying, hey, if you're interested in this field, that field, engineering, you're interested in environmental professions, here are the suite of grants and the continuum that you have access to. If it's early learning, if it's native language preservation, those resource guides, we want to be disseminating that information. But we have access to some of that now, so if I could just make sure to give you my card, and we can follow up on conversations, and we'll make sure and put you in contact with people who have the answers if we can't readily point you somewhere. Yeah.
Maybe one more question, then I think we're going to wrap it up and have a drum song. And I certainly welcome anyone who wants to come sing with us. And so why don't we have one more question, and then we'll close up for the day.
I have one if nobody else does.
Okay.
Anybody else have a question?
It's kind of harsh. Is your initiative looking into the difference in practices between the states that do the best with Native American students compared to the worst? I know Tennessee and Texas are graduating close to 90% of their high school students, which is real close to the general population, where South Dakota and Minnesota are graduating in the 40s.
Yeah.
So to have a 100% discrepancy between the two, I just wonder, there must be something significantly different going on. And I wonder if you found anything blatant that might explain some of that.
Yeah, no, definitely between, our school improvement grants and looking at, the STEP pilot, and kind of the correlations of where we see these kinds of elements, if not indicators of strength that are leading to better student outcomes is an area of interest for us. And right now, honestly, we have not been methodical in trying to look at, assessing where we are seeing those strong outcomes and how they are mapped to these elements, these indicators, the disaggregation of data, the presence of culturally responsive education, or value of differentiation, and the tribal state mechanisms for coordination and collaboration. That activity either happening formally or informally, but yet still leading to the strong incomes. That's where it's gotten us as no-brainer as those three things kind of seem. It's gotten us a long ways to just try to advocate for the inclusion of those within federal programming now. And as I mentioned on the grants, contracts, and resources, our kind of advocacy for you all at the federal level is say, can we have a set-aside? All right, there's no appetite for a set-aside. Can we have a preference? We can't have a competitive preference? All right, then talk to me about an invitational. If we can't have an invitational, can you offer some technical assistance to our population on this area? Can we do some specific targeted outreach on this RFP? And can we make sure that there's a safe place and time, and we can make sure that the community is there for them to engage in this? And if we can't do that, then give me a darn IOU. Let's talk about this on the next budget cycle, revisit this same question, And so our efforts in those three areas have been devoted primarily towards that, knowing that we have this extinguishing reality that I'm a political appointee, getting that done. But you're absolutely right that we need to be studying more about what is working in Indian country. And I think, right now the investment is that under these state tribal education partnership efforts is kind of where we're seeing those factors come into play. And so we look forward to studying that, but that doesn't mean that there's not other areas, school improvement, higher education, and I think we're getting at that issue with the NSI initiative and connecting that to the First Lady's hope for creating that pipeline as well, where we see those kinds of initiatives and programs that establish those connections. And so there's much to be studied there. I just talked to the American Education Research in their conference up there in Philadelphia, and they have a specific indigenous SIG group. I know Dr. Reinhardt's very familiar with their level of activity. That's something that I think we could really mobilize our academia, our academics around really addressing at those issues, and how can we roll that up and share and disseminate.
All right, Lee Wet.
Thank you.
Great questions. I just put up here our website. If you didn't, I'll leave it up here, and again, I'll kind of send a sheet of resources back on the points that I discussed today for Dr. Reinhardt. And here you'll see we have a number of maps. One is this NASNATI group that we've posted up. This is going to be refreshed with the native serving institutions, the 98 institutions nationwide. but it'll give you an idea of how we're trying to visually, as well as in definition and operational definition, just start to begin the path towards creating this identity. And in respect to the President's College 2020 completion goal, we're looking at what are those contributions. How many degrees annually does Northern Michigan need to complete and award in order to be able to contribute to the 2020 college completion goal, and so that we can help you set benchmarks and help mobilize around making sure that we are a part of that equation. So thank you so much.